Welcome, everybody, to our session of Turn on Federalism. My name is Soren Keil, and I work at the Institute of Federalism at the University of Freiburg. Welcome to today's session, where we talk about territorial self-governance and separatism, the case of Eastern Ukraine. Many of you know about our Turn on Federalism series. Those of you who are new and who are here for the first time, welcome. Turn on Federalism is a joint cooperation between the Hans Seidel Foundation and 50 Shades of Federalism. The Hans Seidel Foundation is a German political foundation with a mandate of the German Federal Parliament, and its core task is to promote and support democracy and the rule of law within Germany, especially through civic education in Bavaria, but also through worldwide activities with over 100 projects in more than 60 partner countries. 50 Shades of Federalism is a website project established in October 2017. On the website, we publish short papers on different aspects of federalism and decentralization. The idea of Turn on Federalism is to bring the papers from 50 Shades of Federalism to life. The idea is to invite the authors and to invite an interested audience to discuss the papers, to assess their contemporary relevance, their practical applications, their comparative value, and therefore enable wider discussions and the sharing of knowledge on federalism, on decentralization, and on different aspects of territorial autonomy. Today's topic focuses on territorial self-governance and separatism, with a special focus on the case of Eastern Ukraine. We will look at questions such as how important government capacity is to reform and implement decentralization, which mechanisms exist to reintegrate secessionist territories, and often which obstacles exist on the process to this. And we will also talk about the role of domestic and international actors in self-governance mechanisms and in the settlement of conflicts. We are very pleased to welcome two experts on the topic with us today. Professor Tatiana Malirenko from the National University of Odessa in Ukraine, is a professor of international security and has a Jean Monnet chair, and Professor Stefan Wolf from the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Very pleased that they've agreed to join us today and to present their paper and their ideas on the topic. As always, our session is being moderated by Thea Bechler, who is a scientific researcher here at the Institute of Federalism. Before I hand over to Stefan and Tatiana, a reminder, please ask questions, share your comments, anything that is unclear that you might want to explain in more detail with us, please use the Q&A box. We will monitor the Q&A box and we will pass the questions on to our two presenters. We hope you enjoy today's session, and we look forward to very interesting discussion. Tatiana and Stefan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Søren, for this very kind introduction and also for the opportunity to present here together with Tatiana. We have a couple of introductory remarks that we'll try to keep relatively short, to no more than maybe 10 or 15 minutes, so that we will then have plenty of opportunity to discuss any of the questions that the audience might have. So as Søren has already said, and as you can see from this title slide here, our focus in this session is on territorial self-governance and separatism. And I'll offer some, excuse me, some initial remarks, sort of more conceptually on these two issues. And then Tanya will follow on from that and talk a little bit more specifically about the case of Eastern Ukraine. So to start with then, there are sort of three points I think that one can make about territorial self-governance. What is it? Why do we need it? And how should it be done? I think they're relatively straightforward, and I think it's best illustrated in a couple of examples of what generally counts as a form of territorial self. So obviously you have issues like federations. You have the question of federacy or autonomy. Sometimes, like in the UK here, for example, it's being called devolved administration. And then most countries, including those that have a structure of the state, still would have at least some form of local self-government. Now, why are such necessary or desirable? But I think that has to do with issues that include better representation and participation of citizens, has to do with localized service delivery, but also, and I think this is particularly important from the perspective of today's talk as well, with the management of different forms of diversity, be it ethnic, religious, linguistic, or regional diversity. Now, one of the main problems that we often encounter in contexts of territorial self-governance, and in particular when it is being applied in settings of conflict, is how do we actually get there? Here I think sort of the ideal typical scenario of having an inclusive process of negotiation and implementation of these territorial self-governance arrangements in consultation and cooperation with all the relevant stakeholders, that very often really is just the ideal type that we don't necessarily find in reality. Certainly not often enough. But what is equally important in the long run also is that once territorial self-governance arrangements have been negotiated and implemented, that they are not necessarily considered to be set in stone, but that there is inbuilt in the arrangements the possibility of future review of the functionality of a particular set of arrangements, and the possibility to adjust them if necessary in order to deliver better on the various promises of territorial self-governance that I mentioned earlier: representation, participation, service delivery, diversity management, and so on. So if we look at Crimea, if we look at Ukraine, then I think we have both opportunities and constraints when it comes to the utility of territorial self-governance arrangements. I think among the opportunities we could consider, first of all, the fact that there still is, and we are basically talking 30 years since Ukraine's independence at the end of the Soviet Union, there is a quite urgent need, I think, for more effective and responsive government in Ukraine. There also are many diversities that need to be accommodated. And whilst we are focusing on the case of Eastern Ukraine here in particular today, this should not obscure the fact that diversity in Ukraine is a much wider issue than just the Donbas region, but we can come back to some of those issues in the Q&A. And then sort of the first constraint that then also translates, the last opportunity that then translates into the first constraint is that there's relatively broad support from Ukraine's Western partners for decentralization reform. But then the constraint, the mirroring constraint, is that those of you who have read the paper on which this talk is based will have seen that there's very, very low levels of support in Ukraine, certainly for the idea of federalism. That partly has to do with what we refer to as the Crimea legacy, where, I mean, for very obvious, empirically verified reasons right now, autonomy was always considered and then in the end proven right as a slippery slope to secession. You also have the issue that the notion of special status that has been promoted very strongly in the Minsk agreements, in particular by Russia, poses quite serious, potentially quite serious and permanent constraints on Ukraine's sovereignty. And then, of course, you have the issue of government capacity and the general fragility of state institutions, which really makes it quite difficult to put in place sort of a suitable balance of power arrangements between different proponents of the various arrangements for territorial self-governance that so far have inhibited what I would say is meaningful progress on reform in this respect. And on that note, for some more specifically Ukrainian considerations, I'm handing over to Tanya.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And I will continue about Ukraine-specific issues. First of all, we have to distinguish between the decentralization which started in Ukraine in 2015 and the special status for self-declared People's Republic if they created with Ukraine. So decentralization reform is mostly concerned on the bottom level of public administration in Ukraine, at the communities, and the relations between local communities and the center, mostly in the fiscal relations. So how taxes are paid, these are delegated to the local level, and the decentralization reform does not touch the level of province, oblast in Ukraine. Is intended to establish a federal, or rather it will be closer to confederation unity between republics and Ukraine. And to be honest, and a lot of confirmation in Ukrainian official speeches of government officials and the declaration that the special status is very unwanted in Ukraine. And a lot of arguments, both objective and subjective, in defense of this position. The first argument is the special status for People's Republic will give Russia the strong leverage on Ukrainian foreign and domestic policy, because local elite in Donetsk and Luhansk are appointed by Russia, and as we can mention and observe during the last couple of days, they even received this status of official members of Russian political party and they have Russian citizenship. So if these territories will be integrated with Ukraine with a special status, Russia can get powerful leverage on Ukrainian foreign and domestic policy. And at the same time, there is a very strong lobby inside of Ukraine against this reintegration, mostly based in Western Ukrainian territories and belonging to different shades of nationalism movements of Ukrainian population, from very radical rights to moderate rights. And the reintegration would cause the clashes between these pro-Russian citizens of Ukraine living in Donetsk and Luhansk and these groups of population. And other arguments may be not as important, but also meaningful is the economic consideration. Destroyed territory with no support for social infrastructure. So it needs a lot of investments. It needs money for rebuilding, for social benefits, to build infrastructure. So for Ukraine, it's not the task that the Ukrainian state can fulfill in this short and long-term perspective. So the special status is a major obstacle for implementation of Minsk agreement, but from the Ukrainian side, but it's very promoted by Russian side. But I also have to say that according to the opinion polls in Ukraine, there is some support among population for integration with special status, and the most arguments against it are from Ukrainian elite. Next slide, please. So what is to be done? And we both agree with Stefan that not so many options, and the status quo will be the most likely option for future. The first, because very weak government capacity. We now have very weak public support for president in his office, the very low level of public trust to him, and he is not in position to initiate some radical changes in the policy now. So for him and his office, the best task is just to keep power, and economy is not developing good, and a lot of competition, geopolitical competition, and around Donbass, and the many sides are very happy with the status quo because they can use the situation in eastern Ukraine as a leverage for the policy. We can see what happened now. So the status quo will be the most likely option for future, and what the focus of reform should be. Of course, the Western partners of Ukraine and Ukrainian civil society and government have to keep the general reform, anti-corruption reform, good governance reform, the decentralization reform, which a little bit stuck now, and also to stabilize situation in Donbass. In the term of human rights, unfortunately, this issue is so totally forgotten now in favor of geopolitical issues. So to focus more on human rights of people who live there, on human security, to protect their life and freedoms of movement, to move from these territories to Ukraine. It's not so easy now. And if we keep Ukrainian state more capable and more transparent and more effective, we can then establish, maybe as a second step, more or less condition for reintegration, or at least for stabilization situation in eastern Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana and Stefan, for this interesting presentation and input on the case of Eastern Ukraine, or Ukraine self-governance question in this regard. It is now my pleasure to moderate this Q&A together. And I would like to ask you, our global audience, to write your questions in the Q&A box. You will find it at the bottom of your Zoom windows, and those questions quite short and succinct so that we have time to read them, but also so that we have enough time to answer as many questions as possible. I see there is at the moment no question yet written there. So in the meantime, I would like to kick off with a first question to you, Stefan, and first, but maybe let me make a very short comment here at the beginning, because there has been some quite worrisome development in the recent weeks and days with Russia's troop movement towards the Ukraine border, which leaves many in great uncertainty at the moment what is going to happen. And I am sure we are going to talk about this later on in this discussion today, and maybe there is also some questions on this topic from the audience. But I would like to start with some questions related to your paper and your presentation first, if you don't mind. My first question has a lot to do with, Tatiana, what you said at the end of your presentation right now, because in your paper you write that territorial self-government or self-governance arrangements are more effective when they are discussed and implemented preventively. And in the case of Ukraine, but that also applies to other conflict-prone states and regions, the conflict has emerged, it has escalated, and it is much too late for prevention. So you write that federal arrangements, or also the discussion around the special status for self-declared people's republics, are quite off the table. And I wonder, in view of the ongoing conflict and the discussions, is it a good idea to take such a discussion off the table to begin with?
Yes, we wrote in paper that maybe not federalism, but a kind of autonomy. It could be good prevention when the conflict in Ukraine started in the beginning of 2014. And maybe proposal for autonomy status for Eastern Ukraine, for Donbass, could accommodate some local grievances after the end of Euromaidan revolution, when Yanukovych escaped from the country. Of course, there were some local grievances and local tensions regarding this fact. But today I would say that the question of federalism not relevant. It's not because it's very sensitive. It is very sensitive in Ukraine, and it frequently linked to separatism. So even federalism, you may raise question from special service, security service in Ukraine, but just now it's not relevant for Ukraine, because the opportunity to use autonomy as a buffer, as a prevention measure, works good when you have a powerful regional elite. Now in Ukraine, is it not the case? So now, before 2014, we could mention several groups of powerful regional elites who expressed their interest and also had local political parties with regionally based electorate. Now we have absolutely different situation. If you look at the electoral map of Ukraine, you can see that now we can say that we don't have powerful political party with regionally based electorate. We have national party. So on the one hand, it's very good. So we have party with wide representation in all parts of Ukraine. So no separatism and no elite for who could express their interest at the local level. So it's this issue, federalization, autonomy status, could play a role as preventive mechanism in 2014. Now it's not. It's not relevant. Maybe Stefan wants to add.
only one sentence, if I may. I think taking it off the table right now is possible also because neither side wants it. I really don't see, for all the reasons that Tanya has mentioned, how this is very high on the agenda of the current president and government in Kiev. And likewise, everything that the de facto authorities in the two so-called People's Republics are saying is also not that they are desperate to be reintegrated into Ukraine. So I think taking it off the table right now is actually one way of ensuring that people can focus on stabilizing what isn't a very stable status quo at the moment. I mean, if you just look at the numbers of ceasefire violations and explosions that are being reported on a daily basis now, I mean, it's basically like war going on already, even without the feared or threatened invasion by Russia. So I mean, people are still dying, people are still being injured. So I think from that perspective, it's really important to focus on stabilization right now, and then to return to more permanent arrangements in the future once you have a minimum level of security and stability.
The role of local elites, and in your paper you also write that territorial self-governance arrangements are hardly possible, and you also just explained that because of the lack of the capable or legitimate local elites. Could you maybe explain a little bit more? Why are there no such local elites? Is there a difference between government-controlled territories and non-government controlled? How could that change?
If you consider the situation with local elite from the center and from the Moscow, of course, there is no free elections, and there is no public participation in policy making, in decision making, and we can say that all local elite is appointed from Moscow. So it's not so big secret how last elections took part in Donetsk People Republic. So there was very strong pressure even on local population to vote in support of the current leader of Donetsk People Republic, Denis Pushilin. So it's not so much freedom, and even for local people who live there, in expression of their interest. And this situation is closer to the political regime, it's close to occupation than to, of course, to democracy. And the condition of de facto occupation by proxy, if we define the situation, we cannot wait for a local elite, for the birth of local elite, which could be supported from the bottom. So the first task of this elite is to perform functions from Moscow. So that, by the way, that is a major concern by Kiev. It's a major concern that Kiev will get the territories with elite which are fully managed from Moscow. So the situation can be changed only if the political regime changes there. If residents will get the right to vote, to elect a local administration, local council, that looks like not very feasible now. And Ukraine-controlled territory, it's absolutely different, of course, situation. That there are some local election and all Ukrainian election, of course, with some limitation, because according to Ukrainian legislation, these territories which are bordering with self-declared republics, they have special regime of civil military administrations with limited political and civil rights of population. So if the government of Ukraine decide, they can cancel election there and appoint administration directly. But nevertheless, there is a democracy there and the possibility for citizens to participate in the life of communities and to establish NGO and free media. So it's absolutely different political regime. And but again, unfortunately, this situation of Ukraine-controlled territories, there is also no powerful local elites. So surprisingly, in the terms of size of territory, self-declared republics occupy only 1/3 of territory of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. But for 7 or maybe 8 years now, these Ukraine-controlled territories, they were not able to produce or to born or to find local elite which could express their interest. They could represent the interest of Ukrainian Donbass in Kiev or outside of Kiev. So it's interesting question why. Interesting question why. So if we're looking again on electoral map of these territories, people vote for candidates and parties which are not based in Donbass and which does not declare any interest of Donbass and does not bring interest of Donbass to Kiev. So no local political party and no local elite there powerful.
We maybe take a step back, Stefan, very quickly and look at how such peace agreements actually come together. Most peace agreements, we very much focus on the structures, on the institutions, from power sharing arrangements, on state organization, but especially after hearing Tatiana's explanations on the role of, or the lack of capable or legitimate local elites, do we underestimate the role of local actors in such peace agreement negotiations or also discussions?
Well, we either do that or we overestimate the control that we have over those local elites. And I think Ukraine is probably more a case of the latter. I mean, if you look at how the Minsk agreement of February 2015 came together, and even the earlier one of September 2014, I mean, these were that was a deal that was made at the highest political level in the so-called Normandy format. And I would hazard a guess here that it probably involved mostly 3 of the participants and possibly only 2. So I think it was mostly a deal between Russia and Germany with maybe some French participation and not a lot of Ukrainian participation. And the problem, of course, now is that we have an agreement in place that, in inverted commas, legalized by a UN Security Council resolution 2015. But it's not been implemented. And I mean, part of the non-implementation, I think, has to do very much with those local factors Tanya has mentioned, but also I think because the actual signatories of the agreement back in have had second and third and fourth thoughts on the matter as well.
This means that. Could you maybe quickly explain what the Minsk agreement is, and also what is written in there, what should be required?
Tanya, do you just want me to quickly do that? So, well, I mean, the Minsk agreement that we are talking about is technically the second Minsk agreement signed in February 2015. And that basically establishes the ceasefire that we kind of have still at the moment, and establishes sort of military exclusion zones and security zones, and all of that works better in some months and certainly worse over the past 3 or 4 months with the frequent violations that I mentioned earlier. But then what the Minsk agreement also does is it sort of charts a path towards basically settling the conflict. And the way it does that is that it mandates a constitutional reform process in Ukraine that has to involve this kind of special status. And examples of what this special status means are then further detailed in a note, in literally an endnote to the agreement, which mentions things like amnesty that you find quite frequently in peace agreements of this kind. But it also has rather vague terminology like the right to linguistic self-determination, participation of organs of local self-government in the appointment of heads of public prosecution, state support for socio-economic development, the opportunity for the self-governing territories to have their own international agreements, in particular with parts of the Russian Federation. And all of that, I think, creates this sense in Kiev and in sort of Ukraine more generally, that what potentially happens here is a straightforward pathway to basically Kremlin control over political processes in Kiev, and that, of course, is tricky, no matter what sort of the international legal status of that agreement might be. And I think these are two things that we need to separate a little bit here. Not to say that legality doesn't matter, but sort of on a practical side, can you actually do that? And I think now that we are almost in February 2022, 7 years after the agreement, with virtually no implementation apart from a shaky ceasefire, I think the answer to that has to be no, you can't.
Anna, did you want to add into that? Or? I would then, thank you very much, Stefan. I would like to include a question from the audience that we received, and it is directed at you, Tatiana. A person is asking whether that, it says that you mentioned partners with their own political agendas, and they would like to know what you actually meant by that, and whether it will be possible to develop this argument a little bit further.
May I clarify question? So the parties with political agenda, local parties in Donbass?
I assume the person is referring to your presentation where you talked about the development at the moment and the different parties that are involved in Donbass, I think, yes. I assume, or maybe the person would like to quickly specify in the Q&A box.
Are partners with their own political agenda? Okay, I see now. Thank you. So this, because this is, I wanted to say that the situation in Eastern Ukraine is used by different political actors in their own interests. So we can start from global actors and consider current informational war between Russia and US with participation of Ukraine. But we can also consider domestic Ukrainian actors, Ukrainian government, and it was before, when Poroshenko was the president of Ukraine, and unfortunately it happened now. Then Ukrainian government used the conflict in Eastern Ukraine to introduce some restriction measures, censorship, for example, or it was during the last presidency, it was close to the special regime in Ukraine to limit the freedom of media. So this very this status gives to political party to speculate and promote their agenda. So to appeal to this conflict, they can argue for status for Ukrainian language as the only one language in Ukraine. The Russian language is the way to, if we speak Russian language, for example, then Putin may say that he can go to Ukraine to protect Russian speakers, stop speaking Russian language. So it's the status quo in Donbass. It provides a lot of arguments with this situation.
Once you just mentioned the role of oligarchic networks, you also write about them in your paper, and the fact that they are often associated with being self-serving, exactly what your point is. If we look back at the question that we had before about local elites, should those oligarchic networks be strengthened? Are they a part of the development of stronger local elites, or do we have to be careful here?
It's a very interesting question, because now in Ukraine, we are in the next round of fight against oligarchs. So the presence of oligarch in Ukraine has both benefits and disadvantage. So oligarchs are the cornerstone of current Ukrainian state. And on the one hand, you cannot just remove them to take their assets and to put them in prison, because in this case, a Ukrainian state collapse. They keep the banking system. They are biggest employees in Ukraine. This energy sector, they manage energy sector and infrastructure sectors. But we have to change the institutions. Change the institution to make impossible for oligarchs to influence Ukrainian policy. But again, at this point, we are not very successful. So we don't change institution, but we want to fight against oligarchs. So now the situation is almost the same as it was in 2014. Before the war, with the exception that oligarchs now not regionally based, but they have interest in all parts of country. So with this factor, we can say that the reasons, the causes for separatism are less than it was in 2014, when they have their regional basis and they wanted to protect their economic power, and they use this separatist movement and the political parties and speculations for negotiation and blackmail the center. Now we have different situation when oligarchs have economic interest in all parts of country, and there is no interest for them to ask for more separation of territory. But again, at the level of relations of oligarch with the state, the situation is not changed. The same individual relations, the same lobby in parliament and direct lobby in the government for legislation, which could get more benefits to oligarchs. So the system remains the same.
Thank you. There is another question from the audience, and I hope the person doesn't mind that I will reformulate it a little bit. We have already heard quite a few times, and could also read in your paper, that in the Ukraine, federalism is very closely associated separatism and secessionism. And we have already talked about the fact that federalism basically is off, or not basically, is off the table in discussions at the moment. However, Stefan, maybe this question is more for you. Do you think that that federalism and territorial autonomy actually do offer for conflict resolution, just not in this context?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's some really good recent academic writing that presents, I think, quite convincing evidence that on balance, it's less likely to have conflicts like the one that we are seeing in Ukraine in systems where you have a degree of territorial self-governance. That becomes even more sort of effective if it's also combined with a proportional system of elections for the national parliament. So I think what that speaks to really is one of the points that I made on my earlier slide, that I mean, if you have a proper representation and participation all different segments of the population, it simply decreases the likelihood that grievances will emerge, and even if they emerge, that they can only be articulated through forms of violent conflict. So in that sense, I think any form of territorial self-governance, whether that's sort of full-fledged federalism all the way down to autonomy arrangements, to devolved administrations, or to some form of sort of meaningful local self-governance, they can contribute to the country levels of government, and that they do have mechanisms in which they can participate in the making of decisions that affect them directly. Contributes very much to, if not conflict avoidance and conflict prevention, so at least to find of managing conflict that does not involve violence, because once violence has started, as we have seen over and over again, it becomes very, very difficult to manage that. And once sort of the demand for secessionism is on the table, it also becomes difficult for it to be accommodated.
About other diversities that we know that also exist in Ukraine, and not only in Eastern Ukraine or in Donbass. Can you quickly elaborate more a little bit on this, and maybe also in reference to what you just said, how to accommodate the diversities in other parts of the country? Sorry.
But I think, I mean, that sort of really speaks to this duality of, I mean, you need to organize government sort of in a, if you want, in a vertical way, where you think about, okay, so what are the appropriate levels at which decisions need to be made? And I think that is always different from country to country, but very often sort of some sort of regional organization of the state does make sense, because you find quite frequently that, say, certain ethnic groups or particular religious groups or speakers of a certain language, they are concentrated in different places or spaces, if you want. And then, I mean, territorial self-governance in a general sense can be quite flexible. It doesn't need to be sort of one size fits all, but it can really try to address very specific local issues. So you can, for example, have a national education system and a national curriculum, but that curriculum can be adjusted to accommodate local specificities, whether that has anything to do with a particular religion that is being practiced locally, whether a different language is being spoken. I mean, just look at Switzerland. I think, I mean, Switzerland is a really good example of how this can be achieved. But then I think sort of this then also needs to be counterbalanced by sort of an overarching sense. Okay, this is still our country, regardless of which religion we practice, what our ethno-national background is, what language we speak. And here I think you need to think about mechanisms in terms of how each of these, let's sort of assume it's organized on a regional basis at one level, how then people who live in these different regions still come together somewhere at the center to also make policy for the country as a whole. Systems. There's been great work by Arnold Leipert now almost 20 years ago, where he found that so-called consensus democracies generally deliver better outcomes. And work that I've done with two of my colleagues recently, we also found that sort of PR election systems certainly are correlated with lower degrees of violence in the context of territorial self-governance arrangements. So I think in that sense, it's really sort of not thinking about the structures first, but really thinking about the issues that need to be addressed or the diversities that need to be accommodated, and then fitting the structures as flexibly as possible around those. And as I said earlier, leaving yourself the opportunity to revisit and sort of see, well, 3 years in, 5 years in, does that actually work? Or are there potentially necessary adjustments that could be made to sort of make the state as a whole more viable, but also show respect for all the diverse population groups that live in a particular state.
If I can, I add to the subject. In Ukraine, the major point of discussion now is the appropriate time for this introduction of diversity or pluralism policy. Before the conflict, it was more appropriate time. And now we have, maybe a couple of days ago, we had very interesting discussion about the human security or national security as a major point of Ukrainian policy. And can we introduce more varieties in education, in interpretation of history, in local history, in school curricula, in language policy in different parts of country, if we are in fact in the state of war with Russia. So we have to consolidate to make us stronger, and maybe later, and some years, when we settle our conflict with Russia, we will be more inclined to these changes. So the major argument is Ukraine against this diversification policy or diversity is that we are in the state of war and we have to mobilize and we have to stretch everything from national identity to resources to arms to wage war to protect ourselves against Russia. So maybe it's not timely reform.
There is one more question from the audience that I would like to ask, and please allow me to just read it because it's and this person, oh no, it has just disappeared. I am sorry.
Oh, sorry. I think answer.
Well, so we address the question still. I'm just going to.
So I think, I mean, the about just trying to organize the situation in Ukraine and with the conflict resolution format there that would resemble the situation in Transnistria? And would it therefore be useful or not to broaden the negotiation format on the conflict in eastern Ukraine, similar to what we have in Transnistria? And what I said in the answer was that I've just written a paper about this. I think the main issue that we have here is that I mean, the Transnistrian format doesn't work particularly well either. The difference that you have between Transnistria and Donbass is that, I mean, in Transnistria, to start with, violence was far less. You didn't have the same amount of displaced people, and you also have a very different geographical situation. So there is no common border between Transnistria and Russia. But I think the lesson that can be learned from Transnistria is that, first of all, it is possible to stabilize the situation and keep a situation stable over long periods of time. Now, having said that, Transnistria is nowhere nearer to a solution than Donbass or Abkhazia or South Ossetia or Nagorno-Karabakh. But what the difference is, and I think where it's useful to think about some of the mechanisms that have been employed in the Transnistrian case, is that it's very stable. You don't have the same issues with free movement that you have in the case in Donbass. You have reasonable people-to-people contacts. You have proper economic relations. So, in a sense, everybody has come to, I think, accept and live with the status quo. And a lot of the work that has been done in Transnistria in particular over the past, I would say, 10 to maybe 15 years is simply improve that status quo rather than really work towards a settlement. And obviously, I mean, that's perhaps not a long-term strategy either, but if you look at where you are in Donbass now with still massive insecurity and all kinds of threats floating around about a new major military escalation, and you look at what has been accomplished in the case of Transnistria, I would find it hard to say, well, it's worse in Transnistria than it is in Donbass. So I don't think it's a question of the negotiation format to come back to the question, but I think it's about what are the priorities and what is the will and the capacity of those currently involved in the negotiations on Donbass, whether that's Normandy format or Trilateral Conflict Group, and what they actually make of the situation.
Thank you very much. Time is moving very fast, and I would like to continue discussing with you for a long time, but I think we are at the last question, and it has to be a very short one, but probably not any easier just because it is short, because I would like to ask both what other countries can learn from the situation in Ukraine, maybe also countries that are in a similar context where self-governance arrangements or territorial self-governance arrangements cannot be implemented preventively anymore. What are your thoughts about that? Maybe I give you the word first, Tatiana.
I could say that if in Ukraine in 2014 and before, if Ukraine had the institution of negotiation and mediation at the different levels, starting from the local level and the institute of referendum in the system of public participation in the life, the situation could not happen, or it would be not such destructive. So the good institution, good governance, and the participation of public in decision-making could prevent the situation. Of course, it could not prevent Russian direct invasion, but it would decrease local support for this invasion.
Stefan?
Yeah, just to pick up on this last point, I think one of the key problems I think that the situation in Ukraine alerts us to is the influence of external actors. And I very much agree with what Tanya has said here. A lot could have been done locally to mitigate the issues that arose sort of in late 2013, early 2014, and then so on, but only to an extent. If there is a malign external actor, a malign and powerful external actor, it is very really sort of respond only with sort of domestic reforms. So there's a limit as to how much meaningful domestic reform can do to prevent external spoilers, if you want, to in a domestic process. By the same token, however, I mean, a lot of the arguably grievances that the external had could also have been dealt with, I think, in a process of both more engagement and more reform. Reflect the external geopolitical context in which a situation unfolds.
Thank you very much for these explanations and elaborations and discussions. I am very afraid that we have to conclude this session now, and I am also sad that this was our last session of 2021, and we are going to go into a little break, and you are a global audience. You will hear from us again as soon as we have the dates for the events of 2022, but we can assure you we are going to continue having sessions of Turn on Federalism. I should also mention at this stage that all the previous events, if you are interested and curious, are available on the website of the Hans Seidel Foundation, and you can also watch some of them on YouTube. And this now leaves me to thank you, Tatiana, Tatiana and Stefan, participating, explaining, for presenting afterwards. And I have learned a lot, and I hope you, our audience, did too. And I would, of course, also like to thank you for all of your questions. I am sorry that we could not go through all of them, but I hope there will be other opportunities to discuss further. And also, of course, we are all going to continue following the situation in Ukraine, and we'll keep up to date. And I'm sure we will hear from you in this regard as well, Tatiana and Stefan. To you, our global audience, if you have any feedback, there will be a short survey. It's only 4 questions. Don't be afraid. Just when you get at, like, after the Zoom call ends, and we would very much appreciate if you could quickly answer the survey. That would be very helpful. And now, depending on where you are, I wish you a very good evening, a very good night, or a very good day, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much, and goodbye.